0300 hours. The jungle airstrip at Fighter 2, Guadalcanal, was still black and dripping with night rain. A single kerosene lantern burned outside the operations hut, throwing a weak orange halo over the hard-packed mud. Somewhere in the darkness, a P-38's Allison engines coughed once, then again, before settling into a low, uneven idle. Inside the corrugated tent, Captain Thomas J. Tommy Lanphier, 339th Fighter Squadron, leaned over a folding table with a chipped mug of coffee in his hand. The steam drifted up and mixed with cigarette smoke. Today's briefing was not about Operation Vengeance, though its success a month earlier still haunted every man in the room. This was a different kind of mission, low, fast, and unsanctioned in its full intent. The goal was to strangle Japanese air power at its roots. Somewhere beyond the Solomon Sea, past Bougainville's rain-soaked ridges, lay Kahili Airfield, a sprawl of camouflaged hangars and palm-fringed revetments where Japanese Zeros, dive bombers, and twin-engine G-4M Betty bombers nested like hornets. Lanphier tapped his pencil against the map. "They've been rebuilding since April," he said quietly. "They think we won't risk coming this low again." "They're wrong." Around the table, the men of the 339th studied the reconnaissance photographs, grainy black-and-white shots taken 2 days earlier by F-5 reconnaissance Lightnings. You could see the airfield perimeter, dispersal bays, fuel trucks lined neatly by the tree line. It was the kind of intelligence photo that made bomber crews salivate and fighter pilots uneasy. The Japanese had concentrated nearly 50 operational aircraft at Kahili, half of them fighters capable of contesting any American raid across the Central Solomons. Colonel Edward Ed McComas, commanding officer of the 347th Fighter Group, arrived just after 0310. He was a tall man with hollow eyes and a voice hoarse from malaria. He laid the final orders on the table, a single-page typewritten sheet stamped 13th Fighter Command, confidential. It authorized offensive fighter sweeps over enemy-held Bougainville, with discretion left to flight leaders on target opportunity. McComas's tone was clipped. "This is not a strafing mission. Repeat. Primary objective is to keep enemy aircraft grounded while bombers hit Kahili tomorrow." But Lanphier's eyes said something else. He folded the paper, slid it into his jacket pocket, and muttered, "Sometimes to keep them grounded, you've got to burn the ground itself." The phrase would later appear, almost word for word, in his debriefing to 13th Fighter Command. Lanphier had been born in 1915 in Benton, Illinois, the son of a Methodist preacher. He had learned to fly in the civilian pilot training program before the war, joining the Army Air Corps in 1941. Stateside, he was known for his precision, top of his class at Luke Field, but in the Solomons, precision meant survival, and Lanphier had become something else. Bold, unpredictable, a man who sometimes pushed the limits of doctrine until it cracked. The 339th had arrived in the Pacific in late 1942, their twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightnings still bearing fresh paint. The aircraft was revolutionary. Twin booms, counter-rotating propellers, a central nacelle housing the cockpit and cannon, and an unmatched operational range. To the men on Guadalcanal, it was more than a machine. It was a lifeline that could reach the Japanese where they once felt untouchable. Yet by May 1943, fatigue had settled in. The humid air corroded everything, malaria thinned the ranks, and the Japanese, though increasingly outnumbered, remained lethal. Airfields at Buka, Balal, and Kahili formed a triangle of resistance. From there, the Imperial Navy launched daily fighter sweeps and night raids, hammering Allied bases. The Solomons campaign had become a battle not only of air superiority, but of logistics, whose machines could stay flying longer, whose pilots could endure more. It was in this context that the idea of a low-level strafing run began to circulate in the 339th's tents. According to declassified 13th Fighter Command debriefing report, April 18th to May 20th, 1943, the suggestion first came informally, likely from Lanphier himself, after a reconnaissance pilot reported that Kahili's aircraft were parked in close formation and uncamouflaged. "It's suicide," one pilot muttered in the mess hall that evening. "AA guns'll shred you before you even hit the strip." Lanphier just grinned. "Then we won't give them time to aim." By 0400, the sky began to lighten. The humid air carried the smell of aviation fuel and wet grass. Crew chiefs moved between aircraft, checking the 4.50 caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon mounted in each P-38's nose. Ammunition belts were loaded with API rounds, the kind that ignited fuel tanks on contact. "Target is Kahili, estimated 40 to 50 planes on the ground," Lanphier briefed over the engine noise. "Approach at wave-top height from the east. We'll climb, roll and dive straight through the strip. 2 passes, Max. Don't linger." He paused, scanning their faces. Most of them were barely in their 20s. One, Lieutenant Ray Hine, had flown only 6 combat sorties. Lanphier slapped him on the shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, Ray. If this works, you'll be buying the drinks when we get back." At 0512, the first P-38 taxied onto the runway. Propeller tips sliced the humid air, leaving silver halos in the dawn mist. The engines roared together, shaking the palms. The control tower signalled green. Lanphier's voice crackled over the radio. "Lightning led to flight. Check in. 2 up. 3 ready. 4 set. Let's go hunting." The formation lifted off the ground, wheels retracting with metallic clunks. The Pacific stretched ahead, a grey sheet under the rising sun. Below, the jungle canopy swallowed the base, and in seconds, Guadalcanal was gone. Later, the Air Force Historical Research Agency would note in its 339th Squadron combat history, May 1943, Lieutenant Lanphier led a 4-ship section on a low-altitude penetration of Bougainville. Objective was to recon and engage ground targets of opportunity. Approach achieved complete surprise. But that entry, terse and bureaucratic, could never capture what the men actually felt in those moments, the raw gamble of life and chance. Flying east of Bougainville, the sea shimmered with morning light. Clouds gathered over the mountains like smoke from unseen fires. The P-38 stayed just feet above the waves, so low that sea spray flecked their windshields. Any higher, and radar at Kahili would spot them. Lanphier stared ahead through the curved plexiglass canopy. Somewhere over those ridges lay 50 Japanese planes, lined up neatly, engines warm, waiting for takeoff. He felt his pulse steady. Crazy, someone had called him the night before. Maybe so. But wars were never won by men who only followed orders. At 0620 hours, as the first faint outlines of Bougainville's coast appeared on the horizon, Lanphier reached for the radio switch and uttered the words that would mark the beginning of one of the most audacious attacks of the Pacific Air War. "All right, boys, let's wake 'em up." 6:47 hours. The horizon split open with a dull amber light as the 4 P-38 Lightnings crossed Bougainville's coastline. Beneath them stretched miles of jungle canopy, dark green and steaming after the night's rain. The aircraft flew so low that the leaves of the tallest trees flickered in their slipstreams. Ahead lay Buka Passage, the narrow channel separating Bougainville from Buka Island, where Japanese anti-aircraft batteries had been emplaced to guard the twin airfields, Buka and Kahili. Both were major nodes in the Japanese defensive perimeter, hosting aircraft from the 204th and 253rd Kokutai, the same units that had once escorted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's doomed flight a month earlier. Since Operation Vengeance, Allied command had noted frantic Japanese efforts to rebuild these bases. Lanphier's flight approached at 30 feet above the surf. Spray misted the windscreens. He throttled back to 240 knots, aligning his compass bearing with the coordinates scribbled in pencil on his kneeboard. 04 degrees 58 minutes south, 154 degrees 40 minutes east. That was the runway at Buka, carved out of coral and lined with coconut palms. "Lead to flight." Lanphier's voice came over the interphone, calm and precise. "Stay low until the shoreline. Once we clear the ridge, follow me in. No second guessing." No one replied. At this height, a single mistake could shear a wing off against the terrain. From the Japanese side, the 4th Air Group War Diary later recorded, "At dawn, conditions clear. 46 aircraft present, 23 Type 0 fighters, 8 G-4M bombers, 15 Type 99 dive bombers. Flight preparations underway for morning patrol. Ground crews at Buka were rolling fuel drums, arming bombs and warming engines. A few pilots lounged beside the revetments, smoking. None of them saw the glint until it was too late, the brief flash of sunlight on twin booms slicing just above the trees. Lanphier pushed his throttles forward and yelled, "Now!" The 4 lightnings surged over the ridge and burst into the open sky above Buka. Below them, the entire airfield spread out like a map, rows of parked fighters, bombers and trucks gleaming in the morning light. The Japanese had lined their aircraft neatly along the main strip, unaware that death was seconds away. Lanphier rolled inverted, pulled back hard, and dove straight down the runway. Tracers poured from his nose guns, white streaks tearing through the air. The first bursts caught a line of Zeros squarely in their fuel tanks. They exploded in a chain of orange fireballs that leapt 50 feet high. Mechanics scattered, some diving into ditches, others frozen where they stood. Behind him, Lieutenant Ray Hine and Lieutenant Frank Taylor followed, strafing the secondary dispersal area. The 20mm cannon rounds ripped through canvas hangars, igniting spare parts and ammunition crates. Taylor saw 2 Betty bombers detonate almost simultaneously. The concussion flipped a nearby fuel truck onto its side. The airfield erupted in chaos. Japanese gunners scrambled to man their 25mm mounts, but the attack had come from so low and so fast that their arcs of fire were useless. One anti-aircraft battery managed a few bursts, the tracers streaking just behind Lanphier's tail. He felt the vibration as a fragment nicked his left wingtip. He banked right, lined up for another pass. "2, coming around!" Hine shouted. Lanphier looked down, smoke already blanketed half the strip. Black columns rose into the clear sky, mingling with debris that shimmered like metallic confetti. He saw the silhouettes of men running between burning planes. This was not just destruction, it was dismemberment of an air force in real time. The 13th Fighter Command debriefing report later summarized it with chilling brevity. Attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Approximately 40 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground by strafing and secondary explosions. No enemy air opposition encountered. But in the moment, the chaos defied description. At 6:51, Lanphier's second pass began. He swung out to sea, climbed to 200 feet, then dove again at a shallow angle directly toward a cluster of Betty bombers near the maintenance hangars. His tracers walked across the runway, stitching through the bomber's wings. One erupted into a rolling inferno, another flipped backward, its tail snapping clean off. Ammunition cook-offs began to thunder across the field. Each Japanese plane carried several hundred rounds of 7.7mm ammunition and fuel enough to feed a small refinery fire. The combined detonation turned Buka into an expanding firestorm. Inside the control hut, a Japanese communications officer transmitted a desperate signal to Rabaul. Airfield under attack by enemy P-38s, total surprise, heavy losses. Intercepted by US listening posts at Guadalcanal, that message would later confirm the raid's timing to the minute. By 6:53, the Lightnings were nearly out of ammunition. Hine called out, "I'm dry," and banked south. Taylor followed, his right engine coughing from a small-caliber hit. Lanphier, however, made one final turn, against every instinct drilled into him. He saw 3 Zeros at the far end of the strip, engines still idling. They were lined up nose to tail, apparently moments from takeoff. He dove directly down the runway again, firing short, measured bursts. The first Zero burst into flame, the second exploded as its fuel ignited. The third, trying to turn away, caught the shockwave and flipped. Lanphier pulled up barely 50 feet off the ground. The concussive blast rattled his canopy. "Lead, you're crazy!" Taylor shouted through static. Lanphier exhaled slowly. "Maybe, but that's 3 fewer we'll face tomorrow." At 6:55, the 4 P-38s regrouped over the coast. Below, Buka Airfield was a furnace of black smoke and orange flame. Secondary explosions continued to detonate at irregular intervals. In the debrief filed later that afternoon, intelligence officers estimated at least 40 enemy aircraft destroyed or rendered inoperable, a mix of fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance types. The Japanese 4th Air Group diary confirmed 43 aircraft lost, including 9 G4Ms and 16 Zeros, with dozens of casualties among ground personnel. One line, scrawled hastily in Japanese, read simply, "Entire morning flight annihilated before takeoff." The wreckage would remain visible from reconnaissance photos for weeks, burnt wings, crumpled fuselages, and the stark white streaks of ruined runways against the jungle. At 700 hours, the 4 Lightnings streaked back toward Bougainville's coastline. Lanphier glanced once over his shoulder at the rising columns of smoke curling into the sky. He keyed his mic. "Good shooting, boys." That'll keep them grounded a while. There was no cheering, no exultation, only the steady drone of engines and the long flight home across the shimmering sea. Low-level attack on Buka Airfield executed by 4 P-38 aircraft under command of Captain T.J. Lanphier. Estimated enemy losses: 40 to 45 aircraft destroyed or heavily damaged, significant damage to hangar and fuel facilities. No friendly losses. Operation characterized by exceptional daring and disregard for personal safety. Action deemed instrumental in neutralizing enemy air capabilities in northern Solomon's sector. In later interviews, Lanphier would say he didn't remember fear, only a cold clarity. He described it not as heroism, but inevitability. "You could feel the war narrowing," he told a reporter decades later. "Every day there were fewer of us and fewer of them. So you take the risk, because if you don't, someone else will pay the price tomorrow." The men of the 339th returned to Guadalcanal that morning to find their breakfast cold, the camp already buzzing with the story of the crazy strafing run. None of them yet realized it would become a case study, filed in official archives, dissected in post-war air power conferences, and cited in tactical manuals for decades to come. At 7:42, Lanphier's P-38 rolled to a stop on the muddy strip. The ground crew stared, wordless, at the powder-streaked nose and the scorched paint along the wings. He climbed out, sweat-soaked and silent, then said the only words that made sense after destroying an airfield in 10 minutes. "Guess they won't be flying today." 7:03 hours. The Lightnings were barely 15 miles from Buka when the first tracers arced upward from the jungle canopy. Lanphier saw them in the corner of his eye, thin red threads climbing fast, crossing the morning light. "Flak!" "Below us, right." Hine's voice cracked through the radio. Japanese anti-aircraft batteries from Kahili Airfield, alerted by the chaos at Buka, had opened fire in a wide, desperate pattern. Dozens of 13mm and 25mm guns poured shells into the sky, forming a shifting web of fire. Each burst left a puff of grey smoke at their altitude. The Lightnings, flying just above the treetops, were racing through a storm of invisible steel. Lanphier shoved his control column forward, diving to treetop level. The P-38's engines roared. Leaves and branches whipped beneath his wings as he levelled off at less than 50 feet. The airspeed climbed past 320 knots. "Stay tight! Don't climb!" he ordered. Taylor's Lightning skimmed the canopy so close its prop-wash bent palm fronds flat. Hine, trailing slightly left, jinked hard as a shell burst directly in front of him. Fragments tore a jagged hole in his right boom. The cockpit filled with smoke, but the engine kept running. "I'm hit but still good," he shouted. At Kahili, Japanese gunners could barely track them. Their firing tables weren't designed for targets flying that low or that fast. A few Zeros scrambled into the air, but the Lightnings had already swept past the danger zone, heading back toward open sea. From the ground, one Japanese lieutenant wrote later, "They came like ghosts, then vanished before the guns could traverse. The air was filled with smoke and the sound of thunder. For the American pilots, the escape felt endless. The sea glimmered ahead, deceptively peaceful. The only sounds inside the cockpit were the rhythmic roar of engines and the shrill wind clawing at the fuselage seams. Lanphier risked a glance at his gauges. Fuel was lower than expected. They had spent too long weaving across the target, longer than planned. The return flight to Guadalcanal would push the limits of their tanks. He keyed his mic. "Flight, check fuel. 2, 90 gallons. 3, 75. 4, 85. Lanphier cursed under his breath. That was cutting it close. Any detour or dogfight would leave them swimming. Still, the adrenaline dulled everything else. His hands trembled faintly on the control yoke. Below, the Solomon Sea shimmered like a mirror, calm and blinding. The coastline of Bougainville receded behind them, now a black plume on the horizon. At 7:12, a burst of chatter filled the radio. Guadalcanal command. "Blue Flight, this is Coast Watcher 1. Recon confirms multiple fires at Buka. You're clear for return. Good work, boys." Lanphier allowed himself a small grin. "Copy that. Tell them to keep the coffee warm." But then, static, followed by a faint, distant transmission in Japanese. It was brief, almost inaudible, but enough for their interpreter later to translate, "Scramble 6 fighters north intercept, enemy P-38 southbounds." Zeros from Rabaul were airborne. Lanphier's flight had maybe 20 minutes lead before the Japanese interceptors closed in. He adjusted course 5 degrees west, hugging the contour of the sea to mask their radar signature. By 7:25, sunlight was fully up. The ocean below was gold and blue, streaked with foam. Hine's damaged Lightning was lagging slightly, one engine trailing a faint line of oil. "You're smoking too?" "I know." "Temps holding. I can make it." Lanphier didn't answer. He knew what that meant. A slow oil leak could seize the engine before they reached base, but they couldn't afford to slow down. Then came the faint shimmer in the sky behind them. Taylor spotted it first. Bandits. High. 10 o'clock. 6 dark shapes descending fast, the unmistakable silhouettes of a 6 M0s. The calm flight home shattered into chaos. The Lightnings broke formation instinctively. Lanphier snapped his stick hard left, climbing into a steep turn. His plane groaned, wings flexing under G-load. Tracers flashed past his canopy. Hine dove toward the water, forcing the pursuing Zeros to overshoot. Taylor rolled inverted, firing a burst from his .50 caliber nose guns as one enemy flashed past. The bullets tore into the Zero's fuselage, and it spiraled into the sea, vanishing in a white splash. Lanphier caught another Zero trying to climb on his 6. He kicked the rudder, rolled inverted, and pulled a tight loop, bringing the Japanese plane into his sights. He squeezed the trigger, short bursts. The Zero exploded mid-turn, its wings disintegrating. "Splash 1!" he shouted. But they were still outnumbered. For 5 frantic minutes, the sky over the Solomon Sea became a dance of silver and smoke. The Lightning's twin engines gave them speed, but the Zeros could turn tighter. Every second was survival. Dive, roll, climb, shoot, escape. Taylor's voice cut in, urgent. "Out of ammo!" Breaking off. Lanphier swore. His own guns were nearly empty too. He could see 2 Zeros still circling, trying to bracket Hine's damaged plane. "Hine, punch it! Full power! I'm losing oil pressure!" Before he could finish, one of the Zeros fired a long burst. Tracers struck Hine's right engine. The lightning erupted in flame, trailing smoke. It descended toward the sea, wobbling. "Hine! Bail out!" Lanphier shouted. No answer. The plane hit the water, skipped once and disintegrated. Lanphier's throat went dry. The others flew silent. At 7:37, the remaining 3 Lightnings finally cleared the pursuit. The surviving Zeros, low on fuel, turned back toward Rabaul. The horizon was empty again, the battle over as suddenly as it began. For the next half hour, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than gunfire. By 8:12, the coast of Guadalcanal came into view. Smoke still clung to their wings from the strafing run. They landed one by one, wheels touching down hard on the muddy strip. Ground crews ran out cheering, but Lanphier didn't celebrate. He climbed from his cockpit, removed his helmet, and stared north, toward the faint smudge of smoke where Hine had gone down. "Hell overhead," he murmured, "and it never really ends." Enemy counteraction. 6 A6M fighters engaged. Estimated 2 destroyed. 1 friendly lost. Lieutenant R. Hine killed in action. Remaining aircraft returned safely. Mission success maintained. Lanphier signed the report, his pen trembling slightly. The clerk noted the date, May 18th, 1943, and the phrase scrawled at the bottom, "For those who flew and didn't come back." By dusk on May 18th, 1943, the Solomons were quiet again. The tropical air was thick with the smell of rain and fuel, but for the 339th Fighter Squadron, the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too deliberate, as if the island itself understood what had been lost. Lanphier sat on an overturned crate outside the operations tent, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. The after-action debrief had ended an hour ago, but he could still hear the colonel's voice echoing in his head. 40 confirmed aircraft destroyed. Outstanding results. 40. The number meant everything and nothing. The intelligence photos would show blackened airframes and craters where Zeros once stood, proof that the crazy run had crippled Japanese air power in Bougainville for weeks. Yet all Lanphier could picture was Hine's P-38 vanishing beneath the sea, an image frozen between success and sacrifice. Mechanics were still working under lantern light, patching holes in wings, counting bullet scars. Each mark told a story. Taylor's plane had taken a shell through the elevator. One fragment missed the hydraulic line by an inch. Another, Lightning's tail, was peppered with shrapnel that would have torn a man apart had it struck the cockpit. Luck had been their only armour. Inside the debriefing hut, intelligence officers from 13th Fighter Command reviewed the gun camera footage frame by frame. The flames, the smoke, the crumbling airfield, every second catalogued, measured, logged. It was textbook precision, one analyst said. Lanphier wanted to laugh. There was nothing textbook about diving through flak at 50 feet. It was chaos guided by instinct. When he finally returned to his tent, he found Hine's cot still neatly made, dog tags hanging from a nail above it. A folded letter sat on the blanket, addressed to Mom. Lanphier stood there for a long time before placing the tags on the letter and walking out. Later, in his mission diary, he wrote only one line. "Bravery isn't what you feel before the run. It's what you live with after." 2 days later, a reconnaissance F-5 flew over Kahili Airfield. The photographs showed devastation, 40 aircraft destroyed or burned beyond repair, fuel dumps still smouldering, maintenance crews digging shallow trenches to bury what was left. Japanese records, later recovered by Allied translators, confirmed the loss figure almost exactly. The strike became known unofficially among pilots as Lanphier's Run. Some called it madness, others called it genius. In the quiet evenings that followed, as rain drummed against the canvas tents of Guadalcanal, the men of the 339th never bragged about it. They didn't have to. The results spoke for themselves, and so did the empty cot that no one dared touch. May 19th, 1943, 0900 hours. The tropical rain fell in sheets over Fighter 2, pounding the tin roofs of the operations huts. Inside, the air was heavy with sweat, tobacco, and the faint smell of burnt cordite clinging to uniforms. Captain Thomas J. Lanphier sat stiff-backed before the debriefing panel of the 13th Fighter Command, his khaki shirt still stained with oil and smoke. Across from him sat Major Harold R. Ennis, the intelligence officer assigned to collate the mission report. A reel of gun camera film rattled softly in the projector. Every few seconds, the grey light flickered across Lanphier's face, the ghostly replay of the previous morning. The footage showed everything, the palm trees rushing upward, the airfield sprawling into view, the first burst of fire that ripped through a parked Zero. Then the camera shook violently as the lightning skimmed low, strafing line after line of aircraft. The Japanese airstrip erupted in orange blossoms of flame. "Pause there," Ennis ordered. The film stopped on a frame, showing smoke pouring from revetments. Ennis leaned forward, tapping his pen against the frozen image. "That's plane 17, burned to the frame." "Your second burst?" Lanphier nodded. "API and HEI mixed belts. We went in so low the prop wash kicked up dirt. Most of them never had their engines running." Ennis scribbled notes, his voice flat but approving. "The estimate now stands at 39 to 40 aircraft destroyed, 15 Zeros, 12 bombers, and a mix of transports and float planes. Japanese records will likely confirm that." He clicked the projector off. The sudden silence was deafening. The mission's success had already travelled fast. A coded dispatch from Admiral William Halsey's South Pacific headquarters arrived that morning, praising the 339th Fighter Squadron for extraordinary initiative and daring in the face of enemy fire. But within the squadron tents, celebration was muted. One cot remained empty. Lieutenant Raymond Hine's name had been added to the casualty board outside operations. Beneath it, someone had taped a scrap of paper with the words, "Died striking at the heart of the Empire." Lanphier had said nothing when he saw it. Later that afternoon, he walked the perimeter of the strip. The rain had eased, leaving puddles that reflected the overcast sky. Mechanics worked in silence, hammering dents out of engine cowlings. The smell of wet earth mixed with gasoline. Major Ennis caught up to him near the hangar. "Hell of a run, Tommy." Command's considering a citation. Maybe the DFC. Lanphier didn't answer right away. He was staring at the streaks of black soot on his Lightning's nose, the residue from burned debris sucked into the intakes. "You ever notice how medals weigh more when someone else should have gotten them?" he asked quietly. Ennis frowned. "You're lucky to be alive." "So was Ray," Lanphier replied, "until he wasn't." The Major hesitated. "His family will want to know he made a difference." Lanphier nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. He did. 40 times over. The official mission report, later archived by the Air Force Historical Research Agency, would list the operation as Fighter Sweep, Bougainville/Buka region. Objective: suppression of enemy air assets prior to bombing operations. Results: 40 enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 1 P-38 lost to enemy action. Lieutenant R. H. Hine. Remaining aircraft returned safely. It was, by any tactical standard, a staggering success. The Japanese 4th Air Group's war diary, captured after the war, confirmed near-total destruction of its ready aircraft at Buka and Kahili, grounding operations for weeks. But behind the clean lines of typed text were details only the pilots remembered: the smell of oil and blood, the metallic taste of fear, the thunder of flak bursting too close to think. 3 days later, reconnaissance confirmed the scale of the damage. Aerial photographs showed burned-out revetments, collapsed hangars, and twisted skeletons of bombers still smouldering. Analysts circled each aircraft wreck in red grease pencil and tallied the results. When the Prince reached the 339th mess tent, the pilots crowded around them in silence. The photos were gruesome in their own way, proof of devastation inflicted by their own hands. Lieutenant Jack Taylor pointed at one frame showing a wrecked Zero with a white tailband. "That one tried to scramble," he murmured. Lanphier nodded. "Didn't get far." Someone laughed softly, half relief, half disbelief. Another pilot muttered, "Damn fool run." But it worked. Lanphier said nothing. He traced the outlines of the burned aircraft with his finger. In the quiet hum of the generator, the only sound was the rain tapping on the canvas roof. On May 22nd, 13th Fighter Command issued a classified memorandum summarizing the engagement for Theatre Command. Lieutenant Lanphier's section displayed exceptional coordination and low-altitude accuracy under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Mission resulted in severe degradation of Japanese air strength at Kahili/Buka complex. Enemy interceptors failed to effectively counterattack. Recommend commendations for leadership and gallantry. The document was filed, stamped, and sent to Halsey's staff. That same evening, Lanphier sat at his small desk under the dim light of a lantern, writing in his logbook. "They'll say it was genius." It wasn't. It was desperation, fueled by too many nights listening to the enemy bomb our tents. We just decided to end it our way. He paused, then added another line beneath it. "The crazy ones always get remembered. The dead ones don't get the chance." Weeks later, Allied intelligence intercepted a Japanese radio transmission acknowledging catastrophic losses at Bougainville's forward fields. One officer was overheard stating, "Our air forces here have been wiped out by the enemy's twin-engine demons." The term stuck. Among the Japanese, the P-38 Lightning earned a new nickname, Ni-10 Oni, twin-tailed devils. For the men who flew them, the name was both curse and crown. In the months that followed, the Solomons' skies quieted. Bombing raids that once faced fierce resistance now met little opposition. The crazy strafing run of May 18th had shifted the balance, if only for a while. Yet even in victory, the cost lingered, a silence that filled the spaces between missions. Every time Lanphier passed Hine's empty cot, he remembered the radio static, the plume of smoke, the final dive. War had a way of turning bravery into legend, and legends, he knew, always came with ghosts. June 1943. The monsoon season came early to the Solomons. Clouds hung so low over Guadalcanal that the jungle and sky seemed welded together, a green-grey world of rot, rust, and endless waiting. The men of the 339th Fighter Squadron repaired what salt and weather had not already eaten away. Their P-38 Lightnings, scored, patched, streaked with oil, stood like sentinels along the strip. The Bougainville raid was already becoming legend. Within weeks it had travelled the entire South Pacific circuit, 40 planes destroyed by 4 Lightnings. Ground crews in Espiritu Santo swore they had seen the smoke columns from 200 miles away. Correspondents from the Navy's press office arrived to confirm the rumour, notebooks open, pencils ready. Lanphier avoided them. He was done telling stories about fire. At 13th Fighter Command headquarters, analysts compiled the full after-action study. The figures were staggering. Cross-checked against intercepted Japanese communications and aerial reconnaissance, the final tally listed 40 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed and 10 additional damaged beyond repair at Kahili and Buka. The report concluded, "Enemy air operations from northern Bougainville effectively neutralized for 23 days. Subsequent bomber missions over Shortland and Balal met negligible fighter opposition. To the brass, it was proof that precision fighter sweeps could cripple entire air networks without heavy bomber support. To the pilots, it meant a rare stretch of quiet nights. No sirens, no scrambling to foxholes under the howl of enemy bombers." Lanphier's name appeared in bold type at the top of the citation request. 2 weeks later, a courier plane brought word from Admiral Halsey's staff. Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf cluster recommended. He never wore it in public. The tactical shockwaves reached far beyond Bougainville. US Navy and Army planners studying the Solomons campaign seized upon the Lanphier run as a model for integrated fighter bomber raids. Instead of relying solely on massed B-24 bombers, they began organizing long-range P-38 strike elements to cripple airfields ahead of amphibious landings. At the 1943 Joint Operations Conference in Espiritu Santo, Air Commodore John C. Clegg summarized it bluntly. If 4 Lightnings can torch 40 planes on the ground, imagine what 40 can do to Truk or Rabaul. The idea seeded what later became Operation Cartwheel, the Allied drive to isolate Rabaul without a full-scale invasion. Every future low-level strike, against Wewak, against Balikpapan, carried echoes of the Bougainville gamble. Back in the States, Lockheed engineers took quiet pride in the reports. Wartime bulletins from the Burbank plant began referring to the P-38 as the plane that can win the Pacific. Mechanics pinned newspaper clippings to the factory walls, their headlines glowing with exaggerated heroism. The myth had legs now. It no longer mattered that the mission had been improvised, borderline insubordinate. History preferred clean numbers and brave headlines. Lanphier wrote to Hine's mother in early July. The letter was 3 pages, careful and spare. He described her son as calm under fire, focused, brave, every word true, none of them enough. Ray was flying on my left wing when we hit Kahili. He held formation through the worst flak I've ever seen. We all made it out of there because he drew half their fire. He didn't fall until we were nearly home. He ended with a sentence that never made the official correspondence file. If courage could be measured in minutes, he gave us 10 more than we deserved. The Air Force Historical Research Agency would later preserve a carbon copy of that letter in its 339th Fighter Squadron files, May-July 1943. The ink had bled slightly from the island humidity, but the signature remained clear. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers painted a vivid counterportrait of the raid. Captain Noboru Abe, formerly of the 204th Air Group, recalled, "The Americans came from the sea at sunrise. Our lookouts saw the sunlight flash on their twin tails, and then everything exploded. Planes burned before the pilots reached them. The smell of gasoline and fire filled the air. We thought it was the work of 50 bombers." The Japanese war diary, captured in 1945 by Allied translators, recorded the event with remarkable candour. 18 Type 0 fighters, 9 Type 1 bombers, and assorted transports lost. Enemy aircraft displayed exceptional accuracy. Anti-aircraft defences insufficient for low-altitude assault. That final sentence, dry and bureaucratic, signalled the collapse of Japanese confidence in their forward bases. Within days, surviving units were ordered north to Rabaul for regrouping. Bougainville's skies belonged to the Allies. In August, when combat rotation briefly paused, a Navy film crew visited Guadalcanal to document the P-38 squadrons. They interviewed mechanics, armourers and pilots for a short documentary titled Twin-Tailed Devils. The footage showed grinning airmen beside their battered Lightnings, engines idling under the palm trees. Lanphier appeared for barely 5 seconds, standing apart, his expression unreadable. The narrator's voice boomed with wartime optimism. "These are the men who broke the enemy's grip on the Solomons, who proved that precision and courage can outfly any number." When the film was screened later in Honolulu, audience members cheered. Back on Guadalcanal, the same footage played silently on a makeshift projector in the mess tent. No one clapped. They all knew the price of those numbers. Combat fatigue was the unspoken disease of the Solomons. The heat, the malaria, the sleepless nights. It all gnawed at the edges of sanity. Lanphier began waking from dreams of fire streaking across the runway, of the radio static that followed Hine's last transmission. Flight surgeon reports from the 13th Fighter Command Medical Section noted a rise in combat exhaustion cases among Lightning pilots after the Bougainville raid. The description read, "Heightened aggression followed by prolonged withdrawal. Command rotated the worst cases to Australia for rest. Lanphier refused to leave. I can't rest while the war's still flying," he told Ennis one evening. "I'll sleep when the last zero hits the water." By late 1943, Allied dominance in the air was evident. Japanese raids on Guadalcanal dwindled to harassment flights. The once feared Zeros arrived in smaller, inexperienced formations. Historians would later point to the May 18th mission as a turning point, a proof of concept that airfields, not aircraft, were the real strategic targets. In the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, Japanese historian Tadashi Yamamoto acknowledged, "After the Bougainville strike, our forward air bases became graves for airplanes. The Americans had found a way to destroy us before we ever took off. Even decades later, veterans from both sides could recall the day in detail. The sound of twin engines approaching low over the palms, the impossible speed, the firestorm that followed." On November 9, 1943, Lanphier received word of his promotion to major. The citation cited uncommon initiative, tactical brilliance, and devotion to duty. He accepted it without ceremony, then spent the evening sitting beside his Lightning's nose, carving a small H into the aluminum under the canopy frame. It was the only memorial he ever made for Ray Hine. When he finally rotated home in early 1944, reporters greeted him on the dock in San Francisco. One shouted, "Captain, what was it like to destroy 40 enemy planes in one day?" Lanphier paused, squinting into the flashbulbs. "Loud," he said, "and over too fast." The archives would preserve the statistics, the reconnaissance photos, the commendations, but among the veterans of the Solomons, the story lived differently, told in half-whispered recollections over beer, ending always with the same line. "It was a crazy run, but it changed the war." By early 1944, the Solomons campaign had entered its final act. The jungle airstrips that once thundered with constant sorties now lay quiet except for the drone of maintenance crews and the corps of distant parrots. The war had moved north, to New Britain, Truk, and the Philippines, but echoes of Bougainville lingered like heat after a storm. Captain Thomas Lanphier sat outside the operations tent at Buka Airfield, staring at the horizon. The sky was absurdly calm. For the first time in months, there were no raids, no scramble alarms, no nervous glances skyward. The quiet felt alien. The 339th Fighter Squadron had become a symbol of what the P-38 could do. Long-range precision strikes, interdiction, and air superiority rolled into one. The press had turned the Bougainville run into a headline legend, the kind of tale that politicians quoted and posters romanticized. But among the pilots, it had become a shadow, a standard impossible to live up to. Lieutenant Ennis said it best one night over watered-down whiskey. "They expect us to pull miracles every morning. You can't burn 40 planes a week without burning out yourself." Lanphier said nothing. He just listened to the sea wind whip through the palms and wondered how long before one of them cracked for good. Ground crews tried to keep spirits high. Someone painted a grinning devil on a scrap of fuselage metal with the words, "Bougainville Breakfast Club." Every pilot who'd flown the May 18th mission signed it in grease pencil. They nailed it to a post beside the briefing tent. The rain washed half the names away within a month. At headquarters, strategy was evolving fast. The Air Corps no longer needed small unit raids. It needed precision coordination across hundreds of miles. The success at Bougainville had proven that fighters could cripple logistics. Now the challenge was sustaining that success across a theatre stretching from the Solomons to New Guinea. Colonel Clifford Pop Kinney gathered the senior flight leaders in June 1944 and laid out the new doctrine. We're not chasing zeros anymore, we're cutting their veins. Supply depots, airstrips, fuel dumps, kill the blood and the heart dies. The P-38s would now fly deep interdiction missions, often alone, sometimes at night. The enemy's air strength was fading, but anti-aircraft fire was heavier than ever. Success came at the cost of endurance and sanity. Lanphier, still commanding sea flight, noticed the toll on his men. They slept in shifts, wrote fewer letters home, and drank more when they did. The laughter of 1943 had turned brittle by 1944. By late summer, the Solomons were effectively secure. American engineers bulldozed new airfields across the island chains, laying the groundwork for the leap toward the Philippines. Lanphier's squadron rotated through brief stints of escort duty, covering B-25s and B-24s bombing Rabaul and Cavien. Every time he saw those bomber formations glinting in the sun, he remembered May 18th. The difference was stark. Now there were dozens of P-38s, hundreds of planes coordinated by radio and radar. No more lone crazy runs. Everything was systemic, planned, sanitized. Yet sometimes, when the light hit just right, he could almost see the ghost of Ray Hine's Lightning flying alongside him, steady, unwavering. In October 1944, a Navy photographer arrived at the base carrying orders from the War Department. He presented Lanphier with the official citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, finally approved after a year of administrative delay. The text read, "For extraordinary heroism and daring action beyond the call of duty in the face of intense enemy fire, resulting in the destruction of 40 enemy aircraft and crippling of critical enemy infrastructure." Lanphier read it twice, folded it once, and tucked it in his flight jacket pocket. Later that night, Ennis found him sitting on a supply crate, staring at nothing. "You earned it," Ennis said. Lanphier shook his head. "We earned it. Some of us just didn't get to bring it home." He sent the medal to Hine's mother the next morning. No note this time. On the other side of the Pacific, the Bougainville raid had left a scar far deeper than Allied intelligence realized. Declassified Imperial Navy records decades later revealed that the destruction of those 40 aircraft crippled Japan's forward projection capability in the Northern Solomons. It forced a chain reaction of redeployments. Planes pulled back to Rabaul, fuel diverted, defensive lines stretched thin. By 1944, Japanese commanders in Truk and Wewak referred to the Solomons front as a lost sky. The once dominant Zero squadrons had become ghosts, fuel-starved, outnumbered and obsolete. Many of their pilots were barely trained teenagers. Bougainville had not won the war, but it had shifted its gravity. Lanphier's orders for rotation came in January 1945. He spent his last morning in the Pacific walking the runway at Barracoma, touching the scarred aluminum of his Lightning as if memorizing every dent. Ground crewmen stood nearby, pretending not to watch. He left them his flight jacket, still oil-stained from the Bougainville run. On the inside lining he wrote a single line in pencil. "Keep flying low. The devil's in the trees." By the time he reached California, the war had already shifted to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Stateside, crowds greeted returning pilots like movie stars. Magazine covers hailed them as the guardians of the Pacific. But Lanphier couldn't stand the noise. The Pacific airfield still echoed in his dreams. The roar of engines, the scream of flak, the radio static that ended with Ray's voice fading into nothing. He declined most interviews, took a brief instructor post at Hamilton Field, then quietly resigned in late 1945. Decades later, historians would try to interview him about the raid. Most found him polite but distant. He preferred to talk about flying technique, not victory. "There's no glory in burning men alive," he told one researcher in 1961. "There's only the duty to make sure it ends faster." The official records of the 339th Fighter Squadron still list May 18, 1943, as the most successful single sortie of fighter aircraft in the South Pacific Theatre. Yet among surviving pilots, it remained something deeper, a moment when courage and madness shared the same cockpit. Years after the war, when Lanphier attended a reunion in Sacramento, the few remaining members of the squadron gathered around a rusted piece of aluminum mounted on wood. It was the old Bougainville Breakfast Club sign, miraculously preserved. Their signatures had faded to ghosts, but the devil's grin still showed through. Someone asked him what he remembered most. Lanphier stared at the sign for a long moment before answering. "The silence after the last engine shut off," he said. "You don't realize how loud the war was until it's gone." The room went quiet, save for the faint hum of a projector playing old footage of their P-38s streaking across tropical skies. They watched in silence, older now, grey, eyes reflecting fire that had long gone cold. In 1980, during the restoration of war archives, a curator found a note tucked in the back of Lanphier's old debriefing folder. It was dated May 19, 1943, written in his unmistakable hand. "We hit them hard. Maybe too hard. If history remembers this, let it remember that we were afraid, and did it anyway." That single sentence, scrawled on faded paper, summed up the legacy of the Bougainville raid better than any medal or headline ever could. The skies over the Solomons are quiet now. The jungle has reclaimed the airstrips, the wrecks rust beneath the palms, and the waves whisper against the same beaches where young men once launched into history. But on certain mornings, when the light hits the horizon just right, old islanders swear they can still hear the twin roar of lightnings sweeping low over the trees, ghosts of a crazy run that changed the war. By the 1960s, the story of the Bougainville run had taken on a life of its own. Magazine features called it "The Day One Pilot Burned Japan's Wings." Aviation historians cited it as the textbook case of initiative under fire. Yet for all the ink spilled, the truth remained quietly buried in the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency and National Archives, among after-action reports typed in fading ink, film reels labelled confidential, and witness statements from men who'd long since stopped speaking about it. The numbers held steady across every analysis: 40 aircraft destroyed, 1 P-38 lost, 1 squadron changed forever. Cross-checked against the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, ATIS translations, and 13th Fighter Command debriefings, the statistics matched almost eerily well. The enemy had been caught off guard, their readiness crippled in a single blow. For once, legend and ledger agreed. But the legend didn't end at Bougainville. The tactic, low-altitude precision strikes against grounded aircraft, became standard doctrine for the 5th and 13th Air Forces. Manuals printed in late 1944 included diagrams modelled directly on the May 18th run, credited anonymously as Case Study No. 17, Successful Fighter Sweep, Solomon Islands. In essence, Lanphier's crazy idea had quietly reshaped the Pacific Air War. At the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion in Honolulu, a frail Thomas Lanphier stood before a room of grey-haired pilots and mechanics. Behind him, a projection screen flickered with the same grainy gun camera footage from 1943, his lightning skimming so low the palm fronds blurred past. When the film ended, the audience rose in applause. Lanphier only nodded, eyes distant. "It wasn't crazy," he said softly. "It was necessary. But don't ever think it was easy." In the front row sat a Japanese veteran of the old 4th Air Group, invited by the organisers. Afterward, he approached Lanphier and bowed deeply. "Many died that morning," the man said through a translator. "We hated you then. Now we respect you." Lanphier returned the bow. "So do I," he said. Today, the records of the Bougainville mission rest in temperature-controlled drawers at the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The film, the flight logs, and the photographs, every piece verified, cross-referenced, and preserved. Historians still debate the fine details: who hit what, which strafing pass caused which explosion. But one truth remains unchallenged. On that humid dawn of May 18, 1943, a handful of men in silver lightnings turned the tide of the Solomons campaign with a single impossible act of audacity. And when the jungle swallowed the wrecks, when the noise faded and the years passed, only the legend remained, etched not in marble or medals, but in the memory of every pilot who ever dared to fly too low and lived to tell the story. Even now, more than 8 decades later, the jungle of Bougainville keeps its secrets. Beneath the vines and coral sand lie the twisted remains of those 40 aircraft, silent proof of one pilot's impossible gamble. The rusting P-38 fragments, the melted engines, the scarred runways, all whisper of a morning when courage outweighed caution. Islanders still speak of distant thunder on windless days, a low, rolling hum that rises and fades across the canopy. They say it's the ghosts of the lightnings returning to the field, flying the crazy run again, forever chasing the dawn.